Final Fantasy VII, The Story. Author, Emerald Princess of Vernea. Category, Final Fantasy VII. Genre, Adventure/Fantasy. Words, 176,694. Rating, B. Status, complete. Summary, the first installment of a complete novelization of Final Fantasy VII. This installment covers the beginning of the game up to Costa del Solution. See installments 2 and 3 for the rest of the story. Please read and review. Episode 1, Part 01, Chapter 01. Disclaimer. Part 1, Midgar. Chapter 1. A voice was calling. The stars were crying out. The spirits were unsettled. A young woman of about 22 years was stood kneeling in the middle of a dark alley, all alone. She was looking through the old, musty window of a run-down shop, with small green sparks of energy falling from a broken pipe around her, floating for a moment in the air before fading away. The woman blinked and placed her hand under her chin as she stood up and looked down, thinking hard. Or perhaps she was listening. Very suddenly the woman turned her head to her left and looked down the alley towards the street, suddenly awoken from her trance by a sound that had come from the street beyond. With a last fleeting glance back at the green sparks of energy, she began to walk down the alley, her long brown hair swaying gently behind her, tied in a long, curled ponytail secured by a pink ribbon and a glowing white ball. Resting on her arm was a small reed basket that was filled with freshly grown flowers that were now in full bloom. As she walked along the dark alley, her long pink dress flowed gently around her ankles and over her brown boots, and over the top of her dress she wore a dark pink-red jacket like a thin tunic. She eventually emerged from the alley and back onto the street, stopping very suddenly as a very large motorbike zoomed up and passed her, missing her by inches, and continued to zoom out across the street. Coming from its exhaust pipe was a long trail of thick, black smoke, and the driver was completely oblivious to the fact that he had very nearly knocked the young woman down. She looked around for a moment at the other people walking across the streets, each one oblivious to the event, walking hurriedly through the streets to avoid the muggers and thieves that often roamed about at night. The street was just as dark as the alley, for the night was set in the sky above them. Yet even in the daytime the city was dark. That was the way Midgar was. It was a cold and dark city, and yet it was always presented as the city where dreams were made. This city was the starting point for the energy of the whole world. The city was shaped like a giant circle, and was split into 8 separate sections by large walls of metal, and 8 separate towers bordering the corners. The towers were actually large reactors that sucked up energy from the ground below and converted it into energy that the people in the city used for their everyday lives. Another large tower was built in the center of the city, much taller and thinner than the reactors, and it was in that building where the city's president and his workers lived, running the city from its well-secured safety. There were 2 levels to the city. The upper level was on top of the 8 sectors in view of the sky, and was in general much more well-run and designed. The buildings were secured and kept in an average state, although the streets were unclean and filled with pollution. The lower levels were the slums, where people unable to afford accommodation on the upper levels lived. The people who lived in the slums were often very poor, making their homes and livings out of anything they could find. The people above had no time for the poorer people, and were generally not thought of at all, even by the richest people. However, it was very easy to see the mass pollution that surrounded the city. The plain that it was built on was a dead and dry ring of black, strangely surrounded beyond that with an area of lush grass. It was as though all the life had been sucked out of the ground around the perimeter of the city, killing off all its lush life and replacing it with a dark, lifeless wasteland that merged into the rest of the land. In the city itself, the pollution came from the number of vehicles that wound through the dark streets, spewing their fumes into the air, although the people were so used to it they didn't notice. The same noxious gases were being ejected from the tops of the tall reactor towers and into the air, polluting it even more, and again no one seemed to notice. At that moment the 11:30 train was just pulling into the station around one of the 8 sectors of the city, pulling up close near to one of the tall reactor towers. It was quiet on the platform while the train began to slow down, with only 2 guards in dark red uniforms standing silently against the walls, trying to think of things to pass away the time until their shifts were over. They clearly weren't expecting anything to happen at any time soon, so they weren't expecting what happened as the train finally came to a gentle stop at the side of the station, and squeaked loudly as the rail skidded and stopped, and a loud puff of steam was released into the air. One of the soldiers glanced up, and then looked down again uninterested. While the soldiers weren't looking, a figure suddenly stood up on the roof of the train from where he had been perched behind one of the funnels that released the gas. He was fairly tall and wore a ragged sleeveless green shirt and dark black trousers and boots. His hair was short and dark brown, and he had a single red band tied around his head. His name was Biggs. One of the soldiers looked up as Biggs climbed up and jumped off the top of the train and landed strongly on the platform. Immediately he began to run to Biggs, knowing for sure that he wasn't a passenger on the train. As he neared him, Biggs reached out and grabbed the soldier by his shoulder, and then turned and harshly pulled on the soldier's arm, lifting him up and throwing him harshly over his shoulder. The soldier flew over quite easily and landed with a heavy thud on the concrete ground, knocked out instantly as he landed. The other soldier stared in surprise as he saw his colleague fall to the ground unconscious as the new arrival attacked him. He recovered quickly though and also began to run towards Biggs, ready to apprehend him for trespassing and assault. He reached out and grabbed onto a small gun that was latched onto his belt, just in case Biggs resisted. However, as he ran across the platform, another figure suddenly ran out from the side of the train and stopped in front of him, and before the soldier could stop, the figure suddenly lashed out and kicked him hard in the chest, sending him flying back against the side of the train. His head collided with the hard, cold metal and he slumped to the ground, also knocked unconscious. This new arrival was a woman, no more than 25 years of age, like her companion. She had long light brown hair that was tied back in a ponytail, and also had a black band tied around her head. She wore a grey top and black trousers, and even from her appearance she looked tough, but still very feminine. Her name was Jessie. As the second soldier slumped heavily to the ground, a third figure ran out from the open door of the train. He was a man, much heavier than Biggs or Jessie. It was fair to say that he was rather plump, but he wasn't so heavy that he couldn't move around. He was fairly short, with a yellow t-shirt and black trousers, and a head of short black hair and a nervous expression from his face. His name was Wedge. After a quick look around, he ran over towards his two friends. A fourth person then ran out of the train, running out of the last door at the far end of the platform. It was another man of about 37, and it was very clear from looks alone that he was the leader. He was very tall and burly, with large, well-trained muscles rippling under his black skin, thick like leather and firm to the touch. His face was strong and well-structured, and he had a small black beard on around his mouth, and black hair on his head. He wore a torn green shirt and black trousers, but what was most amazing of all about this man was that on his right arm there was a large gun. His hand was missing completely on his right arm, and in its place there was the gun, grafted onto him so he could use it as a weapon. He was called Barrett Wallace, and there was no doubt that he was the leader of the others. As Barrett ran out of the train, he turned and signaled back at the train, and a fifth and final person stood up on the roof of the train, and whilst holding onto the edge of the roof, he flipped down and landed perfectly on the ground in front of Barrett. This final person was much younger than all of the other people, and looked no more than 21 years old. He wore a strange purple outfit like some kind of uniform, with a large black belt around his waist to keep it in place. The top half of the suit clung tightly to his body like armor, while the lower half below the belt was much more baggy and free, tucked into his black boots. There were no sleeves to this suit, but over the young man's left shoulder there was a curved plate of metal with blunt spikes sticking out of it, like shoulder armor, and tied around his left wrist was a black amulet with empty circular slots in it. Resting on his back was a monster of a sword, for the blade was extremely wide and thick to cause maximum damage, and looked very heavy as it was strapped onto his back. He had a head of spiky blonde hair, and it was fair to see that he looked rather attractive, even though he had a cold and uncaring expression. The most eye-catching feature about him was his eyes. They were a stunning blue color, and they almost seemed to glow through the darkness as he looked over at Barrett expectantly.
"Come on, newcomer," Barrett said curtly to the young man. "Follow me."
With that, Barrett turned and ran off away from the young man, following his other three colleagues who had run off across the platform and through an open door just seconds before. The young man waited for a moment before he followed, and then began to run across the platform after Barrett. Just as he passed the first soldier that lay unconscious beside the train, another door at the end of the platform opened up, and two more soldiers ran out. These were different from the other soldiers, for they were wearing blue uniforms, and carried larger guns in their hands. They stopped for a second as they saw the spiky-headed young man just a few meters away from them, but then they charged forward with their guns at the ready, prepared to attack the intruders. The young man watched as the two soldiers ran over to him, not making any moves that would cause them to shoot him before they were close enough to him. Once they were just a few feet away from him, the young man reached out and grabbed one of the soldiers by his arm, and then powerfully swung him around in a large circle. The soldier was hardly able to keep his balance as he was swung around, and could only see a blur as he staggered over his feet, so he was completely caught off guard as he slammed into his partner and fell down onto the ground, toppling down onto him, and the two soldiers lay stunned while the young man ran off hurriedly across the platform and out through the other door to the alleys beyond. Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie were all waiting in the next alley, all standing nervously outside a large metal door that stood nearby. Jessie was kneeling at the foot of the door, typing furiously into a small metal box that was positioned on the floor, showing a small keypad filled with numbers and letters. The door was locked by a prefix code, and she was trying hard to crack it. Biggs and Wedge were standing behind her and watching for any soldiers that might come their way, and Barrett was nowhere to be seen. As the young spiky-headed man walked over towards them, Biggs looked up.
"Wow, you used to be in soldier all right,"
he said, his voice filled with awe.
"Not every day you find one in a group like Avalanche."
Jessie stopped typing for a second and looked up at Biggs, a flash of horror crossing her face.
"Soldier!"
she exclaimed. The terror showed in her voice.
"Aren't they the enemy? What's he doing with us in Avalanche?"
"Hold it, Jessie," Biggs said hurriedly before Jessie started swinging her fists. Jessie was really quick-tempered when it came to something like this.
"He was in soldier. He quit them and now is one of us."
Jessie nodded, but it was still clear from the look on her face that she was unsure. To hide her anxiety, she turned back to the panel and began to type again, while Biggs turned back to the blonde-haired man.
"Didn't catch your name."
The young man looked at him indifferently.
"Cloud."
Biggs nodded his head slightly.
"Cloud, I'm."
In response, the man called Cloud shook his head.
"I don't care what your names are,"
he replied coldly.
"Once this job's over, I'm outta here."
Slowly, Biggs nodded his head again and turned back towards Jessie, feeling a little put off by Cloud's cold response. Just then Barrett ran up from one of the side alleys that wound their way around the reactor area, and came to a stop beside them. He looked from one person to another, and a wave of anger spread across his face.
"The hell you all doin'?"
he raged angrily as he glared out at the four people standing in front of him.
"I thought I told you never to move in a group."
Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie all flinched as Barrett shouted at them angrily. Cloud looked from one person to the other as they jumped and shuddered at the sound of Barrett's angry voice, which gave him the impression that Barrett shouted at them a lot. As he finished shouting, he took a deep breath to calm himself, and then pointed up to the metal door that Jessie was trying to open.
"Our target's the North Mako reactor,"
he informed them, keeping the stern, almost stressed tone in his voice.
"We'll meet on the bridge in front of it."
At that moment there was a loud click from the door as Jessie finally managed to crack the code, and the large set of metal doors began to slide open, the metal scraping hard against the dry, paved paths of the alley. As the doors opened fully and stopped on either side of the wall, the three miners got up and ran through the door before Barrett could tell them to get a move on, running into the enclosed area beyond and out of sight. Barrett ran forward towards the open door and watched his colleagues run on. Before he followed them, however, he turned back towards Cloud. The expression that was on Barrett's face said it all instantly. The elder man was looking at Cloud with a pure look of disgust and hatred, similar to the way Jessie had looked up in fear when Biggs mentioned that Cloud was an ex-soldier. Cloud didn't know Barrett really well at all, and Barrett didn't know him, but with just one look Cloud knew that Barrett didn't like him one little bit.
"Ex-soldier, hey?"
Barrett asked Cloud. Even in his voice, the waves of hatred that he was aiming at Cloud were apparent. He eyed Cloud up and down, and curled his lip angrily.
"Don't trust you."
With that, Barrett turned and ran off into the enclosure, following his teammates into the reactor area. Cloud stayed behind for a few moments as Barrett ran out of sight, and then he turned his gaze up towards a tall structure looming above him. Their train had come to a stop at the very edge of the city of Midgar, right at one of the points where two sectors joined, separated by a reactor building. The tall tower that rose up at the edge of the sectors was just one of the 8 reactors that powered the city, and was just one of the sources of Midgar's power and money. It was a very restricted area, and Cloud knew the consequences of what would happen if they were caught. For a second or two Cloud looked up at the tall, cylindrical shape of the reactor, before he too ran off through the open doors and into the vicinity of the reactor. The long alleyways that he ran through as he made his way silently through the reactor vicinity were empty, with hardly a single soul in sight. There was in fact no one around apart from him, which made it seem as though the operators of the city had very bad security, but that was because no one had ever attempted to break into the actual reactors before. Barrett and his friends were the very first to attempt this, and it looked as though it was going to be an easy trip. Cloud soon spotted the other members of Avalanche up ahead. In the shadows around him he could see the tiny, silhouetted figures of Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie as they made their way carefully through the shadows, using them as cover to prevent from being seen by the numerous CCTV cameras that were posted everywhere. The three moved at consecutive times, moving one after another to make quick dashes across the patches of light and diving into the shadows again just as the cameras swerved down in their direction. Cloud couldn't see Barrett anywhere, but he got the impression that Barrett wasn't going to be as subtle with his movements as the other three were. Eventually Cloud saw the building that they were heading towards, the building that was built just beneath the tall reactor tower. Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie were heading towards this tower, slinking across the shadows and avoiding cameras until they slipped through the open door and into the building. Moments after they entered, Cloud saw Barrett make a strong dash across the floor and into the building as well. Cloud waited until the camera on the other side of the alley he was standing in passed by, and then he also hurried over and slipped through the door. It was almost as quiet inside the reactor building as it was on the outside. There were hardly any soldiers around at all, which seemed quite unusual since this was supposed to be a high-security building. There were 1 or 2 soldiers around, but as Cloud entered he saw that these blue-uniformed soldiers were lying on the floor unconscious, after Barrett and his cronies knocked them out. This was the first checkpoint of the mission. They were on a T-junction bridge, with a door at the far end leading to another exit, and a door down the longer path leading towards the reactor. Wedge ran off from the group and stood at the far door, guarding their future exit, while Biggs, Jessie, and Barrett all ran down towards the other door. Cloud followed them. The three were waiting for him on the other side, standing outside another locked metal door. Biggs was trying to unlock the code for this one, while Jessie looked around anxiously for any signs of Shinra soldiers. Barrett had his arms crossed and was tapping his foot impatiently as Biggs typed into the small console, and as Cloud walked up calmly he scowled, a pure look of dislike.
"Yo, this your first time in a reactor?"
he asked Cloud curtly, not even looking at the young man. Cloud shook his head.
"No,"
he replied simply, also refusing to look at Barrett.
"After all, I did work for Shinra, you know."
The mere mention of that fact seemed to make Barrett scowl even more, and a look of concern once again spread across Jessie's face. They were in a Shinra building right then, with Shinra soldiers prowling anywhere. Jessie thought it was an extreme concern that they should have someone who once worked for Shinra working with them. Like Barrett, she believed Cloud would have to prove himself a little more before she trusted him completely. Biggs and Wedge accepted him immediately, but she and Barrett would need a little more convincing than that.
"The planet's full of Mako energy,"
Barrett said suddenly, as though he was giving Cloud a rundown of the situation.
"People here use it every day."
Cloud shrugged dismissively. He didn't really care what people used Mako energy for, and besides, he already knew. Barrett glared at him angrily.
"It's the lifeblood of the planet, but Shinra keeps sucking the blood out with these weird machines,"
he shouted heatedly, waving his arms around madly. Cloud sighed heavily and shook his head.
"I'm not here for a lecture,"
he replied simply, expressing no anger.
"Let's just hurry."
Barrett frowned angrily and pointed furiously at Cloud.
"That's it, you're coming with me from now on,"
he raged. Again Cloud shrugged. Barrett's resentment towards Cloud did not bother him at all. In fact, he didn't really care. Barrett was a person with a lot of issues, and Shinra and Soldier was just a couple of them. At that moment Biggs typed in the right code for the door, and the panel glowed green.
"Code deciphered,"
he announced, and the door slid open. He and the other Avalanche members ran through the door into the smaller room beyond, which was just another security checkpoint, where another metal door blocked the way. Jessie ran straight to this door and punched a code into the panel.
"Code deciphered,"
she called out as the panel turned green, and the door slid open. Jessie, Barrett, and Cloud ran through the door to the next room. Biggs stayed behind in the middle room, since this was his checkpoint. The others meanwhile had to head down into the deep bowels of the reactor, where the core was. The elevator that led down into the reactor core was at the far end of the next room. Jessie ran up to the door and pressed a button. Almost immediately the metal door of the lift slid open, and together the three walked into the small, enclosed lift. Barrett stomped over to the far end of the elevator and leaned against the wall, staring at the ground in deep thought. Jessie and Cloud walked in after him, and as the door to the lift slid shut Jessie pointed to the other end of the elevator, towards a small red button.
"Press that button over there," she said.
Cloud followed her instructions and pressed the button on the lift. There was a stomach-churning jerk as the lift began to move, heading down into the depths of the reactor building and underneath the upper plates of the city. Jessie looked up at the ceiling and sighed heavily, trying to calm herself. It was a stressful mission, and they didn't know when the enemy would show up, so they had to take every precaution that they could. While the lift began to move down the floors, Barrett turned to Cloud.
Little by little the reactors will drain out all the life, and that'll be that,
he said to the mercenary, trying hard to make him understand. Cloud looked at Barrett and shrugged.
It's not my problem,
he replied.
The planet's dying, Cloud.
The blonde-haired mercenary shook his head.
The only thing I care about is finishing this job before security and the robo-guards come, he said.
Angrily Barrett turned away from Cloud and shook his gun arm. For a second or two he was very tempted to turn and smack Cloud across the head, but he knew that was something he couldn't afford to do. Cloud may not have looked like the strongest person in the world, but he was an ex-member of Soldier, so looks may be deceiving. Cloud also had inside knowledge and experience of Shinra security systems, and although it was costing Barrett an arm and a leg to employ Cloud's help, he couldn't risk Cloud walking out at such an important stage in the mission. So he swallowed his anger and refused to look at him. End of chapter. Episode 2, Part 01, Chapter 02. Chapter 2. The group of three then fell silent as the lift continued to move deeper into the reactor building. All the while Barrett refused to look back at Cloud, for he was fuming by Cloud's lack of concern for the safety of the planet. Quite frankly, Cloud couldn't care less about Barrett and his team. He knew far more about the Shinra and its reactors, far more than the likes of Barrett did, and would ever know. He knew what sort of security Shinra had within the reactor buildings, and no matter how much research Barrett and his cronies did, they would never understand the true scale of Shinra's reactors. At that moment the lift gave a sudden shudder as it came to a stop on the level below, and the door slid open. Straight away Jesse ran through to the section beyond. Barrett glared at Cloud and nodded his head towards the door. He wanted Cloud to go first so he could keep an eye on him. Cloud sighed heavily and shook his head almost pitifully, and then ran through the door of the lift, with Barrett following closely behind him. The next area was part of the main reactor system. There was a large metal structure in the middle of the hall, rising up until it almost touched the ceiling. There were a number of large, round pipes flowing all around the area, going into the walls and the floor, pumping power throughout the whole facility. The whole place was a booby trap in itself, which was why the reactors and maintenance was so important. One thing could go wrong in the building, and the whole place would explode. A set of stairs wound their way down the side of the metal structure, and Jesse, Barrett, and Cloud were hurriedly making their way down those stairs. Time was of the essence, since they had no idea when the guards in the building would be alerted of their presence. There was a single door based at the bottom of those stairs, leading into another chamber, and the three intruders kicked the door open and ran through. Now they were in the real bowels of the reactor chamber. The way they had entered was almost like a back passage, since the only way through was by going across a number of grids crossing about 20 meters above the ground. Jessie had managed to hack her way into the Shinra database and knew the outline of the reactor pretty well, so she led the way as they entered the reactor itself and began to run across the grids. The only way further down into the reactor was by going down a number of angled ladders towards over crisscross grids. Jessie's stop was around here. As they climbed down the first ladder and onto the next level, Jessie ran over towards the other end and stopped by another ladder. She nodded at Barrett, who nodded back at her. Now it was Barrett's turn to lead the way down towards the reactor, whilst still keeping a close eye on Cloud. The avalanche leader jumped up onto the next ladder and began to slide down towards the pipes below, and then ran across the bulky, spherical pipes that crossed over the ceiling above the main floor. Cloud followed him across the pipes and down the final ladder, until they finally reached the level where the reactor was based. Together, Barrett and Cloud walked down the long walkway towards the reactor. On either side where the bridge ended, there was a long drop towards the bottom. More pipes were gathered there, and clouds of red-hot steam prevented them from seeing what lay at the very bottom. The reactor lay just ahead of them. It wasn't very big in itself, for it was just a large cylinder half embedded in the wall, with faded, burnt writing scrawled over its surface. Of course within the wall there would be numerous contraptions designed for sucking out the Mako and converting it into energy to power the city, but that wasn't what they were interested in. It was the reactor that they wanted. As they approached, Cloud spotted something out of the corner, laid on the graded floor just a few meters from the reactor. It was a small green ball about the size of a tennis ball, and looked at first like a giant marble, although there was a strange kind of shimmer to it. Cloud knew what it was straight away. It was known as materia. It was a ball of compressed Mako energy that had been released from the reactor. Each bit of materia had a different use. Cloud actually had two pieces of similar-looking materia himself, slotted in special slots the black armlet he wore around the base of his black gloves. Two more slots were embedded on the blade of his sword. Barrett also spotted the materia on the floor, just after Cloud. He took a quick glance at the ex-soldier, before he swiftly reached down and picked the materia up, putting it safely in his pocket so Cloud could not get it. Cloud looked back at him blankly, not really bothered. Barrett glared at Cloud angrily, and then walked up towards the reactor in front of them.
When we blow this place, this ain't gonna be more than a hunk of junk,
he said to Cloud as he looked up at the reactor. There was a strong sense of hatred in his voice as he spoke about the reactor, similar to the way he spoke to Cloud. Barrett turned around and pointed to Cloud.
Cloud, you set the bomb. Shouldn't you do it?
Asked Cloud.
Just do it,
Barrett shouted suddenly, waving his strong arms angrily in the air.
I gotta watch to make sure you don't pull nothing.
Cloud sighed heavily.
Fine. Be my guest,
he muttered. He took a step forward, but all of a sudden he stopped. He froze to the spot, his muscles tightening almost until they hurt. A wave of cold ran through his veins, although he was not afraid. At the same time a high-pitched whistle began to ring in his ears. Watch out! This isn't just a reactor. The whistling faded, and Cloud felt his muscles relax and let him breathe once again. Surprised, Cloud stepped back and shook his head, shaking off that peculiar feeling that he had just experienced. There had been no voice the way he would describe a voice, and he wasn't sure whether he had heard anything at all. Barrett clearly hadn't heard anything, for he was looking at Cloud with an impatient look on his angry face.
What's wrong?
He demanded. Cloud looked up and blinked.
Hey. What's wrong, Cloud, hurry up.
Barrett ordered him, growing very annoyed with Cloud's stalling.
Yeah.
Sorry, Cloud apologized. He shook his head again and blinked. The feeling had disappeared now, and he could no longer hear the dreadful whistling in his ears. Whatever it was that had startled him so suddenly had gone now. Barrett was becoming more intolerant of him by the second, so Cloud walked forward towards the reactor. Barrett reached into his pocket and pulled out a small device, and passed it to Cloud. It was a bomb, one that clearly had been made by Avalanche themselves, and not one they had got professionals to make. Jessie was an expert in those kinds of matters, and she had made this bomb herself. It was small and fragile, but would be very effective against the reactor. Cloud took the makeshift device and knelt down beside the reactor. He placed the bomb at the foot of the reactor, pushing it right against the wall in its darkest crevice so that no one would spot it and disarm it before it could go off. There was a small keypad on the front of the bomb, to input a time limit. Cloud typed in 10 o'clock. 10 minutes would be all they needed to make their way out of the building again, giving time to fight off any security that came their way. All of a sudden, a loud siren went off, ringing loudly throughout the reactor chamber. Barrett looked up in surprise as a red light flooded the chamber. They should have known planting the bomb on the reactor wasn't going to be that easy. A loud grating noise suddenly began to reverberate throughout the chamber, and Cloud stood up and looked behind him.
Heads up, here they come,
shouted Barrett. Coming down the corridor towards them was a rather nasty-looking robot. It looked like a giant, chunky scorpion made of red metal, standing on two thick legs that ended in pointy tips, digging into the metal grating as it stomped its way down the path towards Barrett and Cloud. On either side of its body were two stocky arms, and over its chest was a metal plate bearing a searchlight, which was waving around frantically as it searched for the intruders. Its face was just a chunk of metal with flashing lights on the front, but rising up behind the robot was a large metal tail that was relaxed at that moment, and was tipped with a laser. Apart from Soldier, this was Shinra's most deadly weapon, a robo-guard. Barrett raised his arm and cocked the gun embedded there, filling its chamber with a number of bullets. Cloud reached up behind him and drew his monstrous sword, holding it strongly in front of him with both hands. The robo-guard came storming up towards them, guided by its searchlight as it swept over the two intruders. It stopped on the path just a few meters away from where they were, and spread its arms wide. The robot was so huge that it blocked the path completely, leaving Cloud and Barrett with no means of escape. Barrett lifted his arm and aimed his gun at the robot. The gun was attached to certain nerves in his arm that allowed him to control the gun without a trigger, and as Barrett desired it, the gun suddenly fired, releasing a chain of bullets into the air. The bullets hit the robot's hard-plated surface and penetrated instantly, ripping their way through the metal towards the robot's inner circuitry. The robo-guard shuddered violently as the bullets hit it, and fell to its knees, but it wasn't defeated that easily. The robo-guard pushed itself back up and dug its pointed feet hard into the metal grating. In return, the robo-guard popped open a plate on its chest, revealing a small gun. The robo-guard fired at Barrett. Hurriedly Barrett jumped back to dodge the bullets, and Cloud dodged swiftly to the side. The bullets sailed past and hit the floor around the reactor. Large holes were punched through the metal as the bullets collided, missing Barrett only by inches. Barrett found himself cornered in the corner of the reactor, with RoboGuard staring at him angrily through its flashing lights. Barrett was safer than he realized, though. The RoboGuard knew that it couldn't fire on the reactor, so it couldn't fire on Barrett while he was there. It hesitated for a second, and then began to turn a little towards the other viable target, Cloud. Cloud lifted his sword up and held it in front of him, grasping the handle tightly in both his hands. The RoboGuard turned towards him, although it was unable to move much because it was in the slim width of the metal path. However, it turned just enough to face Cloud, and raised its long metal tail up in the air. Once it was raised up above its head, it stiffened and began to quiver slightly, as though trembling in anticipation. Cloud did not move, for he knew what the RoboGuard was doing. He glanced over towards Barrett, who was just raising his gun arm to fire on the robot while it seemed frozen.
"Barrett, be careful,"
Cloud warned him hurriedly.
"Don't attack while its tail's up. It's got a counterattack with its laser."
Barrett glared at Cloud with an angry look. He was still unsure as to whether he could trust him or not, since he was a former enemy. Cloud looked back at Barrett with a serious look in his eye, and Barrett finally listened and withdrew, and together they waited as the robot stood in front of them, its tail poised. Finally, the tail began to slacken and fall back down behind the robot, and the RoboGuard finally began to relax a little. Straight away Barrett raised his gun arm and fired a series of bullets at the RoboGuard, and it made a hideous screaming sound as the bullets struck its hard armor. It even withdrew a little, though not by much, for it was surprised by the attack, and not harmed. Cloud turned to Barrett and signaled for him to cover him. Barrett caught Cloud's signal and nodded his head, and watched as Cloud turned to the robot. The ex-soldier spun his sword behind him and put it back in its strap on his back. He then turned to the robot and ran forward, falling on his back as the RoboGuard swung one of its arms round to hit him. It missed Cloud by inches, and he skidded on the metal ground until he was underneath the RoboGuard's body. As soon as Cloud was safely underneath the robot, Barrett began to fire again, and more screeching screams came from it as the bullets hit their targets. Underneath the robot, Cloud found himself looking up at the underside of the RoboGuard. He flipped open a small hatch on the underside of the robot to where the main controls was hidden. Inside there were a number of flashing lights. While the robot shuddered and stamped its feet around him, Cloud began to punch a few of the buttons, trying to find the one that would deactivate the robot. Eventually he found it, and pushed it. There was a huge sigh from the robot as its power supply was cut off, and it sagged suddenly against the ground, nearly crushing Cloud as he slid out from under it. The robot's arms fell down onto the ground, and the lights on its face went dark and empty. Now the robot was like a corpse blocking their path, no longer a threat. Barrett went over to the robot and looked it over, a look of disgust on his face. He suddenly kicked the robot angrily. The alarm was still going on around them. There was no doubt now that the soldiers in the building knew where they were, and it would only be a matter of time before soldiers came to take the place of their fallen robot guard. Cloud looked at Barrett.
"Come on, let's get out of here,"
he said. Barrett looked back at him and nodded. He and Barrett both clambered over the powerless robot, and began to run down the corridor back the way they came, heading for the exit. There was only about 10 minutes left on the bomb they had set, and no doubt Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge would be getting anxious with the building ready to blow at any minute. The two threw themselves on the ladder and began to climb up at top speed to Jesse's lookout spot. As they reached the top, Barrett immediately turned and ran for the next ladder to head out of the building. Cloud was about to follow him, when he suddenly saw movement out of the corner of his eye. He turned back and saw Jessie still standing by her lookout. She had her back turned to him and appeared to be tugging on something.
"You all right?"
Cloud asked, running over to her. As he neared her, he saw that Jessie had caught her leg in a piece of broken metal grating, and she was trying to tug it free.
"My leg got stuck,"
Jessie replied, and Cloud knelt down beside her to help pull her leg out of the grate. It came away quickly, and Jessie stood up.
"Thanks."
She and Cloud then turned and began to follow Barrett up the ladder. Barrett, of course, was already out of the building and halfway up the stairs towards the lift. As he expected, there were a few soldiers running down the stairs after him now, but Barrett very easily disposed of them, either by shooting them with his gun arm or simply by throwing them over the sides of the stairs. Even as Cloud and Jessie followed further down, they had to fend off the soldiers coming up the stairs. None of them wanted to be in that building when it blew. They eventually made it to the lift. Barrett ran in first, followed by Cloud and Jessie. Jessie ran straight to the button and pushed it repeatedly to make it go up, and the lift doors shut tight as the lift began to shakily go up. As the lift went up, Jessie looked at her watch impatiently, counting off the seconds in her head. She glanced up at Cloud and gave a shaky smile. She was anxious, but was still enjoying the thrill of what she was doing. The lift finally stopped and the three poured out onto the corridor. Biggs was waiting for them at the end, standing by the door that had shut as the alarm sounded. Jessie tore on ahead of Cloud and Barrett and rapidly punched in the code to open the door. It was a different code now, but she had done her research well and was prepared.
Code deciphered,
she shouted over the sound of the siren. The doors opened and they all fell through, where Biggs ran to the next door and punched in his own code.
Code deciphered,
he yelled as the doors opened, and the group ran through. The Avalanche members darted out of the room and back onto the T-junction corridor. Wedge was still waiting for them impatiently at the door on the opposite side to where they came in, looking around anxiously as the alarm sounded around him. He looked up in relief as he saw the others running his way, and he kicked open the door to let them through. One by one the group dashed through the door, with only a few seconds left before the bomb would blow. As they ran, Jessie suddenly tripped over her boot and fell onto the ground, lying stunned until a pair of strong arms suddenly pulled her roughly up off the ground. It was Cloud. Once she was up, she began to run again, with Cloud close behind her, and through the door. As they ran through the door, a loud explosion occurred from within the building they had just left, and a giant ball of flames suddenly burst through the doors and into the corridor as the bomb exploded. The entire building shook violently as though struck by an earthquake. Then the main explosion occurred. Outside, the reactor suddenly exploded, sending a large shockwave of energy hurtling through the air and across the city of Midgar. A ball of flames rose up into the air, followed by a mushroom-shaped cloud of smoke. The smoke rose quickly into the air, blending into the dark land around it. Bits of metal from the exploded reactor fell out around the sector where it had been built, and down into the city below. No doubt the whole city heard the explosion, and the flames could be seen for miles around. End of chapter. Episode 3, Part 01, Chapter 03. Chapter 3. As the explosion calmed down, Cloud and the members of Avalanche stood silently in a corridor, still inside the Shinra building. The force of the explosion had caused the reactor to be completely ripped apart, and a large chunk of it had fallen down in front of them, crushing part of the corridor and blocking their exit. At that moment Jessie was on her knees with a smaller, less violent bomb, and was busy encoding it beside the wreckage. The others all stood around her in silence, contemplating over the acts they had just done.
That should keep the planet going,
Biggs said suddenly, breaking the silence. The others looked at him.
At least a little longer.
Yeah, Wedge said enthusiastically. Barrett crossed his arms and looked down towards the ground. He muttered silently. Cloud leaned against the wall with his own arms crossed. He made a darting glance towards Barrett. The Avalanche leader was completely silent, and had remained so since the bomb exploded. Cloud thought at first maybe Barrett was having regrets over what he had just done, but as he saw a small smile of relief cross his face, Cloud knew that he did not regret it. The explosion of the reactor would have caused a lot of damage to Shinra, and Barrett seemed glad to know that. Just then, Jessie stood up.
Okay, she said. Now everyone, get back.
The group all jumped up and ran back into the corridor away from Jessie's bomb. Moments later the bomb exploded, not as loudly or as destructively as the one that destroyed the reactor, but powerful enough to shatter the wreckage that blocked their way and revealed the exit. The doorway was now surrounded by a wall of flames made by the bomb, so the only way the group would get out of there was to jump through it. Cloud was the first to jump out. He flipped out of the door and rolled quickly onto the ground to put out any flames that may have caught him as he jumped through. Once he was sure that there were no flames on him, he stood up and turned back. Barrett was the next to jump out of the door. Jessie and Biggs, who ran out with their arms shielding their faces from the flames, followed him closely. Wedge came out last. As he ran out, he patted the back of his trousers rapidly, a line of smoke rising from them where they had caught fire. He patted the small spark of fire until it went out, and then he turned to Barrett.
All right, now let's get out of here,
Barrett said suddenly.
Rendezvous at the Sector 8 station. Split up and get on the train.
Biggs, Wedge, and Jessie nodded, and then turned and ran off in different directions towards the sector, continuing their separation techniques to avoid any suspicion. Barrett waited until the three were out of sight before he too began to run away.
Hey!
Cloud protested suddenly. Barrett stopped on the stairs near to where they stood, and looked back at Cloud.
If it's about your money, save it till we're back at the hideout, he replied.
The harsh tone was still in his voice as he spoke to Cloud. Even after all they had just done, Barrett still did not trust Cloud. Before Cloud could protest again, Barrett was off and away up the stairs towards the nearby sector, following his comrades. Cloud waited a minute or so before he followed. He walked up the stairs that led up into the sector, and looked out at the aftermath of the explosion. There was complete discord in the sector right then, just as Cloud expected. The explosion of the reactor had caused a panic in the city, and there were many people running around madly in fright as they wondered what had just happened to them. Wreckage from the blown-up reactor lay everywhere on the streets, and had even destroyed some of the buildings. The old theater in the sector center was in ruins, and everything had come to a complete stop. A giant chunk of the reactor was still lying smoldering in the sector center, and it was here that the people were running around the most, crying out to each other as they tried to figure out what was going on. As they looked up towards the spot where the reactor had once been, they could see that it was on fire. Clouds of smoke were billowing up into the air in giant gushes, and flames were still covering the broken cylinder. The explosion of the reactor had caused a power cut throughout the city, and it was very dark indeed. The young flower lady was still standing on the street corner beside the theater, looking around in bewilderment as she tried to figure out what was going on around her, although she was much calmer than the rest of the citizens. A man suddenly ran into her as he ran past in a panic, and she fell back onto the floor. As she stood up and brushed herself off, wiping away the dirt, she spotted Cloud as he walked past, trying to look casual amongst the panicked people. She quickly ran over to him.
"Excuse me,"
she said in a delicate voice. Cloud stopped and turned to her.
"What happened?"
she asked. For a moment Cloud nearly panicked, unsure of what he should say to the woman without her arousing suspicion that he had anything to do with the explosion. As he looked into her face, he felt something strangely peculiar about her. There was a strange feeling emanating from her, something he couldn't quite pinpoint. She looked very kind and gentle, and her brown eyes were very calming and almost spiritual. She seemed very innocent, and not the type of person he expected to see in a rough and run-down sector such as this one.
"Nothing,"
Cloud told her plainly. At that point he should have walked away, but for some reason he felt almost compelled to say something.
"Hey, listen."
The woman looked at him inquisitively, and Cloud rubbed the back of his head nervously.
"Don't see many flowers around here,"
he said finally. The woman blinked at him, confused. Then she looked down at her basket.
"Oh, these?"
she asked.
"Do you like them? They're only a gill."
She looked at him hopefully. Cloud reached into his pocket and pulled out a two that he had kept, and passed them to the girl.
"Oh, thank you,"
she said. She put the 2 coins in her pocket, and then took 2 different flowers from her basket, one pink, the other blue, and handed them over to Cloud.
"Here you are,"
she said, and Cloud took the flowers. Before he could say anything else the woman was walking off. Cloud watched her as she walked away from him, still feeling that peculiar feeling about her. He did not know what that feeling was, but he was certain that there was something about that girl. He shrugged, dismissing the feeling, and continued to head through the sector towards the station. By now the people were beginning to settle down, and the streets were a little quieter than they were a few minutes before. There were only a couple of people wandering around now, and they were no longer running in a blind panic. Even the power was beginning to return now as Shinra reconnected the power lines through another reactor, so things were gradually beginning to return to normal. No one took any notice of Cloud as he walked along, for they were so busy wrapped up in their own affairs. As Cloud walked along, he stopped and looked up at a nearby wall that had just been lit up by a street lamp as it came back on. There was a message written on the wall in bright red spray paint, and Cloud recognized the words. "Don't be fooled by Shinra. Mako energy doesn't last forever. Mako is the planet's life source. The end is in sight. Protectors of the planet, Avalanche." Cloud shook his head. Barrett. Only Barrett would write a message like that on the wall, not caring whether he was caught or not. He didn't know why Barrett was so hell-bent against the Shinra company, and, quite frankly, he didn't really care. All he cared about now was getting his pay and getting out of there. He had no other reason to stay with the rebel group now that his work was done. Cloud left behind the painted sign and carried on down the street towards the train station where they were supposed to meet. By now the streets were completely abandoned and no one was around, as far as Cloud could see.
Hey! You there!
Cloud stopped in surprise, realizing that he wasn't alone after all. He turned to look behind him, and saw two soldiers dressed in blue uniforms walking towards him. They each had rifles in their hands, and were advancing on Cloud slowly.
Shinra soldiers!
Cloud cursed. He quickly turned and ran down the street away from the soldiers.
Halt!
One of the soldiers shouted, but Cloud continued to run. Seeing this, the two soldiers raised their rifles and began to fire at Cloud, for they had seen him as suspicious the moment they laid eyes on him. Cloud could feel the bullets striking the ground at his feet. They weren't trying to hit him, but to make him stop. He reached the end of the street and turned sharply right to the next street. As he turned, he quickly skidded to a stop. There were two more Shinra soldiers standing directly ahead of him, also with rifles that were aimed at him. Quickly Cloud turned around and headed the other way, and the soldiers began to chase him. Cloud only managed to run a few steps before another two soldiers burst into the street directly ahead of him, blocking off his only escape route. Turning back, he could see the other four soldiers advancing on him, and on the other side the two soldiers ahead were also advancing, their rifles raised and ready to fire. Cloud had no way to go, so instead he backed off slowly towards the edge of the bridge that was behind him, overlooking the railway. The sound of the train's horn could be heard faintly as Cloud found himself cornered at the edge of the bridge, the 6 soldiers surrounding him in a semicircle.
That's as far as you go,
one of the soldiers said smugly. Each of the soldiers had their guns raised, ready to fire if Cloud made any other attempts to escape.
I don't have time to be messing around with you guys,
Cloud protested, but it was useless trying to fool the soldiers. They knew he had been up to something.
Enough babbling. Grab him!
The soldier commanded. The soldiers then began to advance once more, and Cloud had nowhere to run. The sound of the train's horn came again, this time much louder, followed by the sound of the train on the tracks in the tunnel below. Cloud opened his eyes wide as he had an idea. Quickly he turned and stepped up onto the edge of the bridge away from the soldiers. Realizing his plan, the soldiers quickly dashed forward, but couldn't stop Cloud as he jumped off the edge of the bridge, just as the train appeared from the tunnel below. Cloud landed on the top of the train and balanced steadily as it sped away from the sector. It moved hurriedly away from the bridge where the 6 soldiers were cursing loudly at his escape, and could only watch as the train disappeared into the next tunnel ahead of them, carrying Cloud with it. The other Avalanche members meanwhile, were inside the cargo hold of the train, after they had quietly snuck aboard before the train left the station. They had waited as long as they could for Cloud, but eventually had to board to avoid being caught by the soldiers that were roaming the sector for them. As such they were very quiet and somber as they stood in the last car of the train, imagining the worst for Cloud. Barrett was the only one who didn't look worried. Instead, he had a frown on his face.
Cloud never came,
Wedge spoke up suddenly, breaking the uncomfortable silence that had fallen upon them.
Cloud?
Biggs muttered quietly, concerned. He looked up.
Wonder if he was killed. No way.
Barrett snapped irritably, before turning back to look at the floor, his arms folded. Jessie sighed heavily.
Cloud?
She whispered. She wanted to thank him for helping her, for she would most certainly have been killed in the explosion if Cloud had not stopped to help her, twice. Just then the sound of a loud scrambling sounded throughout the car. Curious, the 4 Avalanche members looked up and glanced at one another, trying to discover who had made the strange noise. The looks on their faces suggested that none of them did, and so they turned their gazes back to the floor, their expressions turning back to sorrow and concern. A few seconds later Biggs looked up once more, and turned to Barrett.
Say, do you think Cloud's going to fight to the end for Avalanche?
He asked hopefully. The irritation on Barrett's face showed as plain as day.
The hell would I know?
He barked angrily. He clearly didn't even like to hear Cloud's name.
Do I look like a mind reader?
Suddenly he unfolded his arms and banged his fist hard on a nearby crate, hitting it so hard it shook.
Humph. If y'all weren't such screw UPS. Hey, Barrett,
Wedge piped up, trying to change the subject.
What about our money?
Another single thud on the crate from Barrett made Wedge shrink back nervously.
Nothing, sorry.
Gradually the 4 members of Avalanche sighed once more, and continued to stand in silence as they listened to the train traveling rapidly on the rails, thinking once more about what could have happened to Cloud, At that moment a loud knocking noise suddenly reverberated throughout the car, and the four looked up at each other again. Realizing that none of them had made the sound, they looked down at the ground again. The knocking noise then came again, louder than before and seeming to come from the outside of the car. Still the Avalanche members did not notice this, and continued to stare at the floor. Finally, the door leading out of the car opened up to reveal the tunnel wall that was zipping past. Then a figure suddenly flipped in from the train roof, and landed with a thud on the ground in the middle of the car. Jessie gasped in delight as she saw the figure standing there. Dirty though he was, covered in soot, it was Cloud.
Cloud!
She exclaimed, along with Biggs and Wedge. Slowly Cloud stood up and began to brush the layers of soot that had gathered on his arms and clothing after he had scrabbled across the roof of the train, trying to find the car where the Avalanche members were hidden. When he finished he flicked his blonde hair and looked around at the relieved faces of the Avalanche crew.
Looks like I'm a little late, he commented plainly.
Only Barrett did not look relieved at Cloud's safe arrival. The look on his face grew even more angry and frustrated as Cloud stood there, seeming to ignore the worry that he had just put everyone through. His fist shook angrily in anticipation of hitting Cloud, and was barely able to contain his anger.
You damn right you're late,
he shouted at Cloud heatedly, unable to see how Cloud was acting so cool about it.
Come waltzin' in here, making a big scene.
Cloud held out his hands and shook his head.
It's no big deal. Just what I always do. Shit.
Barrett swore loudly, losing his temper with Cloud.
Having everyone worried like that, you don't give a damn about no one but yourself.
Cloud shrugged dismissively. Then a strange smirk spread across his face as he looked at Barrett almost tauntingly.
You were worried about me? Wah!
Barrett raged, thrashing his arms through the air. For a moment it looked as though he was going to hit Cloud there and then, but he managed to calm himself just in time, although his temper was still flared.
I'm taking it out of your money, hot stuff.
He turned quickly and headed towards the door leading into the next train car.
Wake up! We're moving out. Follow me.
With that, Barrett pushed open the door of the car and headed out, leaving Cloud and the rest of Avalanche behind him, although he left the door open. Wedge was the first to push himself up off the crate he had been sitting on, and walked to Cloud.
Hey, Cloud, you were great back there,
he commented, before he turned and walked through the door after Barrett. Once he was gone, Biggs walked to Cloud.
Cloud. We'll do even better next time,
he said, and he also walked through the door. Jessie was the only one remaining in the car with Cloud. She waited for a few moments as her two colleagues disappeared through the door, before she pushed herself away from the wall and headed towards the open door leading into the tunnel.
Be careful,
she warned Cloud.
I'll shut this.
Cloud watched as Jessie pulled the lever that released the door, and pushed it shut. When she was done she turned to Cloud, and looked him up and down carefully. A smile spread on her face as she did so, and nearly burst out laughing.
Oh, Cloud.
She laughed.
Your face is pitch black.
Before Cloud could react she suddenly reached out and began to rub at his face with her hand, wiping away all the soot that had been smeared over him when he was on the roof. When she had got most of it off she pulled away and smiled.
There you go,
she said. She then walked past Cloud, heading for the other door, when she suddenly stopped and looked back at him with another gentle smile.
Say, thanks for helping me back there at the reactor.
Then she passed through the door, leaving Cloud alone in the cargo car. He waited for a moment before he finally walked through the door towards the next car. End of chapter. Episode 4, Part 01, Chapter 04. Chapter 4. The next car was quiet and almost empty, with just a couple of strangely dressed punks at the far end, a man in a posh suit holding onto the rails looking sick, and a few layabouts with no real place to go, almost seeming to be making their home in the train itself. It was quiet, until the speaker on the wall crackled into life, and a computerized voice spoke out to them.
Last train out of Sector 8 station. Last stop is Sector 7, train graveyard. Expected time of arrival is 12:23 a.m., Midgar Standard Time.
At that point the door at the far end of the car opened and in came Avalanche. Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge all stormed into the center of the car and looked around, their fists clenched and ready for a challenge. Upon their entry the two punks jumped in fright and quickly charged out of the car. Barrett then entered the car and quite confidently and arrogantly sat himself down on one of the seats, his arms spread out across the top to mark his territory. Shakily the man in the suit released the rail he was clinging to, and turned away.
This is why I hate the last train,
he mumbled quietly to himself.
Boy.
He then walked out of the car, in the hope of a less threatening place to sit. Only the layabouts and unnecessary people remained in the car, and seemed to ignore the group as they made themselves comfortable in the car. One particular man was reading a paper to avoid looking at the group, and as he read he suddenly turned to his companion next to him and showed him the recently printed article.
See the headlines in the Shinra Times?
He asked.
The terrorists that bombed the #1 reactor are based somewhere in the slums. Blowing up a reactor. They sure put some thought into this one. They must have a real calculating leader.
Barrett looked up upon hearing that, although he tried to look nonchalant.
I wonder what they'll do next.
Just then the man looked up and spotted Cloud standing next to him, who had also been listening to the conversation. He gave Cloud a curious look, and Cloud quickly turned his head away to avoid his gaze. He quickly walked down the aisle, where Barrett suddenly reached out and grabbed Cloud's arm, pulling him harshly close to him and whispered sharply down his ear.
Stop acting like a dumb kid.
He ordered Cloud roughly.
SI down and shoe up.
Just as roughly Cloud wrenched his arm free out of Barrett's strong grasp and continued down the aisle to where Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse were standing casually. Barrett glared at Cloud for a few more seconds before turning away, his face glaring angrily at the people around him.
It seems as though this train hasn't switched to security mode yet,
Biggs said suddenly, and Cloud turned to him. Biggs was leaning against the wall, glancing out of the window and watching the tunnel zip past them like a blur. He turned to Cloud.
I'm sure that will change by tomorrow.
He smiled knowingly, when all of a sudden he yawned loudly.
That sure took its toll on me. I'm gonna sleep till we get back to the station.
With that Biggs crossed his arms and leaned heavily against the wall, closing his eyes and relaxing for the rest of the journey. Cloud turned to the other side of the train, where Wedge and Jesse were stood. Wedge was holding onto the rail nervously, while Jesse was staring blankly at a computer screen in front of her. As though sensing that Cloud was watching, Wedge suddenly turned around to face him.
Someday, Avalanche is gonna be famous, and me, too.
He said excitedly.
Cloud, don't you think I've got a bright future ahead of me? What do you have in mind?
Cloud asked. Truthfully, he didn't care what plans Wedge had for the future, for they were no doubt meaningless and probably wouldn't amount to anything. Still, Wedge seemed excited, and it seemed only fair to hear him out. Wedge smiled happily.
All my life I've felt like nothing but a sidekick. But after joining Avalanche and trying to save the planet, I feel like I can do lots of things.
He then turned away, and Jesse turned to him.
Hey, Cloud, you want to look at this with me?
She asked.
It's a map of the Midgar rail system. Let's look at it together. I'll explain it to you. I like this kind of stuff. Bombs and monitors. You know, flashy stuff.
Cloud walked up next to her, and Jesse showed him the blank computer screen. As he stood beside her she reached out and pushed one of the buttons below the screen.
Okay, it's about to start, she said.
As she spoke the screen came to life, and a 3D graphic image of Midgar appeared. It showed the whole circular shape of the city, as well as its top plates and underground cities.
This is a complete model of the city of Midgar,
Jesse explained, sounding like an auditor giving a speech to a group of tourists.
It's about a 1/10,000 scale. The top plate is about 50 meters above ground. A main support structure holds the plates up in the center and there are other support structures built in each section.
She suddenly leaned in close to Cloud and whispered quietly into his ear.
The #1 reactor we blew up was in the northern section. Then there's #2, #3, all the way up to the #8 reactor. The 8 reactors provide Midgar with electricity. Each town used to have a name, but no one in Midgar remembers them. Instead of names, we refer to them by numbered sectors. That's the kind of place this is.
She sighed and turned to the screen.
Phew, this is next, look.
The screen in front of them flashed as a new image appeared on the screen. The screen appeared to zoom in on a particular part of the city map, in particular the sectors that the train was currently traveling through. A number of white dots began to appear on the map, following a strict route from one sector to the other.
This is the route the train is on,
Jesse continued, indicating the white dots.
The route spirals about the main support structure, we should be coming around the center area, right now. At each checkpoint an ID sensor device is set up. It can check the identities and backgrounds of each and every passenger on the train by linking it up to the control data bank at Shinra headquarters.
She leaned in once more to whisper to Cloud.
Anyone could tell that we look suspicious, so we're using fake IDs.
Her speech was cut short as a bright red light suddenly flashed throughout the car, followed by a faint beeping noise. Cloud jumped and looked up as the red light swept over everything and everyone in the car, but he could see that he was the only one reacting to it. Jessie laughed at his reaction, and put a hand on his shoulder.
"Speak of the devil,"
she commented.
"That light means we're in the ID security check area. When the lights go off, you never know what kind of creeps'll come out. Anyhow, we're almost back now, that's a relief."
She paused for a moment, thinking hard, until she clicked her fingers.
"I know, next time I'll give you one I made myself." "Looking forward to it," said Cloud. "Okay, then I'll put a little extra effort in, and make it with a bang,"
Jessie said excitedly, seeming to get fired up at the prospect of making Cloud a fake ID.
"We're almost there. After talking with you, I really want to do it. I think you've lit my fuse."
She turned away back to the computer, still looking eager and excited. Cloud just shook his head and turned away from her, thinking she was extremely strange. He walked back to the main aisle, where Barrett had turned to look out of the train window, and was looking up.
"Look, you can see the surface now," he said solemnly. "This city don't have no day or night. If that plate weren't there, we could see the sky."
Cloud walked over to where Barrett was sat and leaned over to look out of the window. Looking through, he could see the various beams that crossed above them. Beyond that there was a dark sky of dark grey-black metal, which was the surface of Midgar. On top of that plate would be the upper parts of the city, where the richer people of Midgar bought actual houses above the plate, where they could see the sky. They had started off above that black plate, but now the train had taken them well beneath it into the deeper and murkier depths of the city. The plate really did look like a kind of black sky, and without the clock inside the train, it would be impossible to guess whether it was day or night above.
"A floating city,"
Cloud whispered quietly.
"Pretty unsettling scenery."
"Hey?" Barrett asked, looking at Cloud in surprise.
"Never expect to hear that out of someone like you. You just full of surprises."
He stood up and walked towards his comrades.
"The upper world. A city on a plate. It's cause of that goddamn pizza that people are suffering. And the city below is full of polluted air. And on top of that, the reactor keeps draining up all the energy."
Cloud pushed himself away from the window and looked at Barrett.
"Then why doesn't everyone move onto the plate?"
he asked. Barrett shrugged.
"Dunno," he admitted. "Probably cause they ain't got no money. Or maybe cause they love their land, no matter how polluted it gets." "I know,"
Cloud agreed, looking down.
"No one lives in the slums because they want to. It's like this train, it can't run anywhere except where its rails take it."
With that, Cloud turned once more to the window and looked out at the dark plate that blotted out the sky. Barrett was right about the pollution. The lower cities of Midgar were very polluted, and there was no fresh air from above. There was only the murkiness that came from the workings of the cities above, and the people below the plate were struggling to find jobs to keep themselves fed and clothes. Cloud couldn't help but pity them, and that was Barrett's only justification for doing what he did. The train continued to rail on along its tracks because, as Cloud had said, it was the only route it could take. It wasn't much longer to Sector 7 where they would be getting off. The train spiraled fairly quickly around the main support structure of the city before spinning off towards the Sector 7 slums. Eventually, the train pulled slowly into the station and its doors opened, letting all its passengers off. The two punks and the suit-dressed man got off first and headed off away from the station towards their homes, which were most likely self-built. The Avalanche members climbed off the train last, of course, and continued to try and look natural as they got off, looking around constantly. Barrett and Cloud were the last to get off, and Barrett looked around at them angrily.
"Yo! Get over here, all ya!"
he ordered sharply. All at once the three Avalanche members jumped to attention and swiftly dashed over towards Barrett. Clearly, no one liked to get on Barrett's bad side, and did exactly as they were told when they were told to. As they all gathered around him, Barrett folded his arms.
"This mission was a success, but don't get lazy now," he warned his comrades sternly. "The hard part's still to come. Don't y'all be scared of that explosion. 'Cause the next one's gonna be bigger than that."
With that he ran off a little down the train platform, before stopping and turning back to his companions.
"Meet back at the hideout. Move out."
In an instant the Avalanche group split. Jessie, Biggs, and Wedge all parted from each other and began to make their way separately down the platform towards the slums, carrying out the same tactic that they did at the reactor. They were indeed a very cautious group, and with good reason. They had just blown up a reactor, and it was now imperative that they seemed natural, and so not to be suspected of anything underhanded. Cloud, unlike the others, simply walked back towards the slums. The Sector 7 slums were indeed in a very bad condition. The ground was thick with dirt that had been pressed down into a form of ground, and the houses built in the sector had indeed been made by hand, built out of various scraps of metal that had been collected over time. The air was very dry and coarse, and Cloud could taste the pollution in his mouth. Not that the people of the sector could notice it anymore. The people that were wandering around in the sector hardly noticed the murky smell anymore, they had lived in it for so long they had gotten used to it. Even the kids that played about on the street ran about without noticing the dryness of the air. Most likely these kids had never seen the above plate, and probably they never would. Up ahead the Avalanche members had gathered together outside a building at the far end of the sector. Like everything else in the slums, it was a handmade building, with a sign that was surprisingly made out of lighting tubes, and spelled out the words Tifa 7th Heaven on the front. At that moment Barrett was running up the steps of the building, and he pushed open the saloon-like doors as he ran inside. Moments later there was the sound of gunfire, and a series of people fled from the building in a fright. Barrett burst out moments later, ranting and raving angrily about them being in his territory. Some of the punks shouted abuse back at Barrett, but when Barrett raised his gun arm once more, they immediately fled as fast as they could. Barrett then walked down the steps of the bar and stood at the bottom like a guard. As Cloud slowly approached the bar, the saloon doors opened once again as a young woman walked out and quickly began to usher Biggs, Wedge, and Jesse inside. She was fairly young, perhaps a year younger than Cloud was, with long brown hair and dressed in a smart t-shirt and a short black skirt, almost quite delicate looking. She looked up as Cloud approached and gave him a brief smile, before she hurried into the bar after the 3 Avalanche members.
Ha, ha,
Barrett sniggered suddenly as Cloud stopped next to him.
You wanna meet your little baby?
Cloud snapped his head round to look at Barrett.
Little baby?
He repeated sternly. Barrett grinned slyly.
Hey, don't act like you don't know what I mean. I'm telling you.
He stopped suddenly and looked around. All the punks had scattered for now, and the area around the bar was empty.
Okay, go on ahead,
he ordered. Cloud did as he was told and walked up to the bar, pushing back the saloon doors and going inside. Inside, the other 3 members of Avalanche were already relaxing, sitting at a table with drinks in their hand as they recovered from their strenuous job. Jesse and Biggs were talking amongst themselves as they drank, while Wedge was downing his drink thirstily, whilst at the same time eating food that had been left over by the previous customers.
Papa!
A little voice shouted suddenly. Cloud jumped in surprise as a little girl in a pink dress suddenly ran towards him, her arms spread wide in joy. As the girl spotted Cloud, she suddenly skidded to a stop, and her face went bright red. Very quickly she turned around and ran off into a nearby corner, hiding her face as she began to sob sorrowfully into her dress. The woman Cloud had seen outside, her name was Tifa, the owner of the bar, quickly ran out from behind the bar and went to comfort the girl.
Marlene, aren't you going to say anything to Cloud?
She asked the young girl softly. The woman then stood up and walked confidently over to Cloud. The young girl called Marlene walked with her, hiding behind her and clutching at her skirt as she waved nervously to Cloud, her face still red and wet with tears.
Welcome home, Cloud,
Tifa said pleasantly to Cloud.
Looks like everything went well. Did you fight with Barrett? Not this time,
Cloud told her plainly. Tifa muttered thoughtfully, thinking hard.
You've grown up. When you were little, you used to get into fights at the drop of a hat.
Cloud scratched the back of his head anxiously. Tifa seemed to think for a few moments more, before she suddenly spotted the 2 flowers that Cloud had clutched in his hand, which he was still holding after he bought them from the lady in Sector 8.
Flowers?
Tifa asked in amazement.
How nice. You almost never see them here in the slums. But... a flower for me? Oh, Cloud, you shouldn't have.
Cloud stared for a moment in bewilderment. He had almost forgotten about the flowers he had bought. He hadn't intentionally bought them for Tifa, but he had nothing else to do with them. As he looked down, he also saw that Marlene had her eye on the flowers as well, intrigued by the pretty colors the petals held. Cloud took one of the flowers and passed it to Tifa, who took it gladly.
Thank you, Cloud,
she said honestly.
It smells wonderful.
She turned towards the rest of the bar.
Maybe I should fill the store with flowers.
Beside her, Marlene was looking a little unhappy about Tifa receiving the flower. While Tifa was turned, Cloud knelt down beside the young girl and held out the other flower. Marlene stared at it for a moment, before her face lit up until it beamed like a light bulb. She took the flower from Cloud, and quickly ran back to Tifa, hiding nervously once more behind her. After that, Cloud turned and headed to the door to find Barrett and talk about his pay so he could get out of there. As he reached the door, there came a loud thundering sound from outside. The saloon doors suddenly burst open, giving Cloud just barely enough time to jump back onto a nearby table out of the way as Barrett stormed into the bar and looked around.
"Papa!"
Marlene cried, running out from behind Tifa and towards Barrett.
"Welcome home." "Yeah,"
Barrett said. His face softened just a little as he saw the young girl happily run to him. He knelt down and picked her up in his arms, placing her carefully on his shoulder. Then he spotted the flower.
"Hey! Where'd you get that flower?" "Cloud gave it to me."
The softened look on Barrett's face disappeared a little.
"Oh. Did you thank him?"
Marlene muttered silently, her face going red with embarrassment. She twisted herself round on Barrett's shoulder to look at Cloud.
"Thank you, Cloud. We'll take care of you." "Are you all right, Barrett?"
Tifa asked Barrett, changing the conversation.
"Great,"
Barrett replied with enthusiasm. Then he turned to the others.
"Get in here, fools, we're starting the meeting."
With that, Barrett, with Marlene still on his shoulder, walked over to an old pinball machine at the far end of the bar. He pulled down the lever and the pinball machine suddenly began to move down through the floor to a secret room that was built underneath the bar, carrying Barrett with it. One by one Jesse, Biggs, and Wedge got up and followed him, jumping down through the hole to the hidden room. As they reached the bottom, the pinball machine began to rise up again, and Cloud finally slipped off the table he had been sat on.
"Sit down,"
Tifa said to Cloud, once again behind the bar. Cloud did as he was told and sat down in one of the stools in front of the bar. Tifa came over and leaned over the tabletop to Cloud.
"How about something to drink?" "Give me something hard,"
Cloud said.
"Just a minute. I'll make one for you."
Tifa stood up and went to the other end of the bar, beginning to mix a drink that was one of her specialties. When she mixed the drink, she shook it vigorously, before putting it on the table and sliding it down to Cloud, who caught it easily.
"You know, I'm relieved you made it back safely,"
Tifa said as she walked back to Cloud. Cloud sipped his drink and looked at Tifa in puzzlement.
"What's with you all of a sudden? That wasn't even a tough job." "I guess not. You were in soldier,"
Tifa admitted, as Cloud sipped his drink again. She looked up.
"Make sure you get your pay from Barrett."
Cloud quickly downed his drink and put the glass on the table.
"Don't worry,"
he assured her.
"Once I get that money, I'm outta here."
The look on Tifa's face seemed to sadden a little as he said that, but Cloud didn't notice and got up out of his chair.
"Cloud, are you feeling all right?"
Tifa asked suddenly. Cloud turned to Tifa, cocking his head in his confusion.
"Yeah. Why?" "No reason,"
Tifa said.
"You just look a little tired, I guess. You had better go down below."
Cloud nodded and went to the pinball machine. He pulled down the lever and went down towards the secret hideout of the rebel group Avalanche. End of chapter. Episode 5, Part 01, Chapter 05. Chapter 5. It wasn't a very impressive-looking room, for it was just the bar's basement that had been converted into a kind of living room for the Avalanche members to meet and plan their missions. A large TV screen and computer was built into one of the walls, and this was where Jessie did her research and constructed the bombs that Avalanche would use. Even now, she was busy typing furiously into a computer. At that moment, the news was showing on the TV, giving a report on the reactor explosion that they themselves had caused. Biggs and Wedge were both sat at a table near the opposite wall, playing cards with each other to pass the time until Barrett was ready to give them a debriefing of their mission, as well as to tell them what their next mission was. Barrett himself was busy punching a punch bag furiously, with Marlene sat on a cupboard beside him and cheering on. She really admired Barrett and looked up to him tremendously, and Barrett clearly did everything that he could to impress her. Cloud doubted that Marlene had any real idea about the seriousness of what Avalanche was doing, but as far as Barrett was concerned, he was protecting her. As Cloud stepped off the pinball machine, Barrett stopped hitting the bag and turned to Cloud.
"Yo, Cloud. There's something I wanna ask you,"
he said. Cloud listened.
Was there anyone from Soldier fighting us today?
Cloud crossed his arms and thought for a moment before shaking his head.
None. I'm positive.
He answered. Barrett punched the bag hard.
You sound pretty sure.
Cloud nodded again.
If there was anyone from Soldier, you wouldn't be standing here now,
he said plainly. There was an instant change in Barrett's expression. Up until then he could have almost been sociable with Cloud, but that single remark quickly changed all that, and his expression turned back to one of pure anger and hatred for the spiky-haired young man.
Don't go thinkin' you so bad just 'cause you was in Soldier,
he warned Cloud firmly. He suddenly moved forward in an attempt to hit Cloud hard on his fair face, but Biggs quickly intervened, getting up out of his chair and grabbing Barrett's arms to hold him back. Barrett struggled, and Biggs was barely able to keep him from lunging at Cloud, who merely turned away and crossed his arms again. Cloud mumbled silently. Barrett growled furiously and turned round to Biggs. With his one good hand, he suddenly lunged and punched Biggs right in his face. Biggs flew up and back, smashing into the wall hard and tumbling to the ground. All at once silence spread through the room, the other members turning to watch. Punching Biggs seemed to slacken some of the anger that Barrett was feeling, so he didn't lunge at Cloud now that Biggs was not in his way, but he still looked angry.
Yeah, you're strong,
Barrett said, turning to taunting now the fighting anger had subsided.
Probably all them guys in Soldier art. But don't forget that your skinny ass is workin' for Avalanche now. Don't get no ideas bout hangin' on to Shinra.
Cloud turned.
Stayin' with Shinra?
He asked in disbelief.
You asked me a question and I answered. That's all.
He walked over to Barrett fearfully and looked up at him. Barrett was a good set of inches taller than Cloud, but to show that the ferocious Avalanche leader didn't intimidate him, he stood up on his tiptoes and looked Barrett as close as he could in the eyes.
I'm going upstairs. I want to talk about my money.
Barrett's fists shook angrily as Cloud turned away from him, and for a moment it looked as though Barrett was ready to lunge again, and Biggs was in no position to stop him. However, this time Cloud was saved by Tifa, who at that moment came down on the pinball machine upon hearing the arguments going on downstairs, and hurriedly ran to Cloud.
Wait, Cloud,
she said.
Tifa. Let him go,
Barrett told her.
Looks like he still misses the Shinra.
Cloud turned angrily.
Shut up,
he ordered Barrett, this time with his own fists clenched.
I don't care about either Shinra or Soldier.
He walked past Tifa, who was looking at him sadly, and then turned back again.
But don't get me wrong. I don't care about Avalanche or the planet for that matter.
Leaving it at that, Cloud turned away and headed over to the pinball machine, lifting up the lever to make it go back up towards Tifa's bar. As he rose up, he could hear the sound of furious punching as Barrett began to hit the bag again, this time much quicker and angrier than before. He didn't feel any regrets over what he said as he began to head for the door of the bar, not noticing the pinball machine go back down to the room below. He looked around the empty bar and then quickly began to head for the door, just as the pinball machine came up once more. Tifa was on the lift, and as the lift stopped, she stepped off and ran up behind Cloud. The lift went down again as she ran to him.
Listen, Cloud,
she pleaded with him, sounding almost desperate.
I'm asking you. Please join us.
Cloud shook his head and walked forward.
Sorry, Tifa.
He lied.
The planet is dying,
Tifa protested, her desperation growing in intensity as she begged him to stay.
Slowly but surely it's dying. Someone has to do something. So let Barrett and his buddies do something about it,
Cloud replied harshly. He turned to Tifa sharply, a cold and uncaring look on his face.
It's got nothing to do with me.
He turned away once more and headed for the door.
So, you're really leaving?
Tifa said indignantly, stamping her foot on the floor and putting her hands on her hips.
You're just going to walk right out ignoring your childhood friend?
Cloud stopped and turned around to face her.
What?
He asked.
How can you say that?
Sadly, Tifa sagged and looked down at the ground. She shuffled her feet uncomfortably against the floor, looking as though she wanted to speak but couldn't find the words. She looped her arms behind her before finally lifting her head and looking directly into Cloud's eyes.
You forgot the promise, too.
Cloud tilted his head to the side in bewilderment.
Promise.
Again, Tifa's brown eyes sagged in disappointment.
So you did forget?
She assumed, nodding her head. She walked up close to him and looked him in the eye again.
Remember, Cloud? It was 7 years ago.
Cloud crossed his arms and looked down at the ground, tapping his foot against the ground as he thought hard to remember the time that Tifa was talking about. He closed his eyes and lifted his head to look up at the ceiling of the bar, with its crisscross wooden beams looking back down at him. For a moment he could not remember anything that Tifa was talking about, until finally a picture came to mind. In his mind's eye he could just about see an old wooden well, which was built in a quaint little town that was his and Tifa's hometown, a place called Nibelheim. Tifa nodded her head and smiled as she realized that Cloud was beginning to remember what she was talking about.
Look, the well, she whispered. Do you remember?
Cloud looked down again, confirming the picture in his mind. Then he nodded.
Yeah. Back then, he said. Tifa nodded. I thought you would never come, and I was getting a little cold.
Cloud sat by the well patiently, tapping his feet gently against the old wood of the well as he waited for Tifa to arrive. The well was built in the center of the town and could be seen from every house built there, since the well was the town's focal point, even though the well had been empty and unused for several years. As he sat there tapping his feet, a gentle breeze blew, making the hair on his arms stand on end, even though it was a fairly warm night. The sky was clear and dotted with stars that sparkled in the darkness. The town was quiet at this time, and Cloud was the only one out. He wasn't alone for long. After he waited a few minutes he finally heard the sound of gentle footsteps against the wood, and as he turned, Tifa appeared from around the corner of the well. She was dressed in an elegant turquoise dress and high-heeled shoes, looking very pretty indeed. It certainly looked as though she had made the effort, which could have been the reason for her being so late.
Sorry I'm late,
the young girl apologized. She walked over to the plank where Cloud was sat, and sat on the edge just beside him, but not facing him. As she sat, she waited for Cloud to say why he had called her out here, but he said nothing. So Tifa turned around to face him.
You said you wanted to talk to me about something?
Cloud sighed heavily, and didn't look at Tifa.
Come this spring. I'm leaving this town for Midgar.
Tifa turned away from Cloud and looked down at her feet dangling over the edge of the well. She lifted her feet up and rocked them gently back and forth, tapping them quietly against the wood. She took a deep breath and didn't look up.
All the boys are leaving our town. But I'm different from all of them,
Cloud insisted.
I'm not just going to find a job.
He quickly stood up on the well and turned to Tifa.
I want to join Soldier. I'm going to be the best there is, just like Sephiroth. Sephiroth. The great Sephiroth,
Tifa whispered. Cloud turned away and walked away from Tifa, heading around the corner towards the back of the well. Moments later, he appeared at the top of the well after climbing up the last few planks to reach the circular hole that led deep into the ground. Once he was secure, he nodded to Tifa, who wrapped her arms tightly around her legs and pulled them close to her.
Isn't it hard to join Soldier?
She asked. Cloud nodded.
I probably won't be able to come back to this town for a while,
he said. He suddenly heard the sound of giggling, and glanced down at Tifa.
Hey?
He asked. Tifa coughed a little as she stopped her giggles, and continued to tap her feet against the wall of the well. She swallowed as she finally stopped laughing, and suddenly grew very serious once more.
Will you be in the papers if you do well? I'll try,
said Cloud. Tifa smiled, and lifted her head up to look at Cloud above her.
Hey, why don't we make a promise?
She suggested. She looked down and tapped her feet again in thought.
If you get really famous and I'm ever in a bind, you come save me, alright? What?
Tifa flicked her hair back out of her way, and her eyes glimmered as she daydreamed.
Whenever I'm in trouble, my hero will come and rescue me. I want to at least experience that once. What? Come on.
Tifa begged him, looking up at him once more.
Promise me.
Cloud stared at Tifa in bafflement, trying to understand what the girl was getting at. She looked at him with an insistent look on her face. She wasn't about to give up until he agreed. So he finally nodded his head, just as a shooting star crossed the sky above him.
All right. I promise. You remember now, don't you? Our promise.
Cloud uncrossed his arms and looked down as he finished remembering, and shook his head.
I'm not a hero and I'm not famous,
he told Tifa plainly.
I can't keep the promise. But you got your childhood dream, didn't you?
Tifa pointed out.
You joined soldier.
Cloud looked away from her nervously and scratched the back of his head. Tifa realized she had caught him out on that, and smiled.
So come on. You've got to keep your promise.
Cloud didn't look up at Tifa. He also knew she had caught him out there, for she was right. He may not have been in the papers, and regardless that he ended up quitting soldier not long after, it didn't change the fact that he had fulfilled part of his dream, and as such should keep part of his promise to Tifa. He still looked like he was about to protest, but was interrupted as Barrett suddenly appeared from the room below, climbing up the long pipe that the lift used to rise and fall between the two floors. As he reached the top, he jumped off and turned to Cloud.
Wait a sec, big time soldier,
he said tauntingly. He delved into his pocket and dug deep, before pulling out a bag filled with money.
A promise is a promise. Here.
He threw the bag away from him, and it clattered on the ground at Cloud's feet. Cloud made a fleeting glance at Tifa, whose face was still beseeching at him to reconsider his decision. Breaking her gaze, Cloud knelt on the floor and picked up the bag, swiftly putting it in his pocket for safety. He then stood up and looked at Barrett.
This is my pay? Don't make me laugh.
Tifa's face instantly lit up in delight.
What? Then you'll...
Cloud put one hand on his hip casually as he flipped his hair.
You got the next mission lined up?
He asked Barrett.
I'll do it for 3,000. What?
Barrett raged furiously, looking as though he was ready to explode. He had hoped to get rid of Cloud quickly.
It's okay,
Tifa said. She took Barrett's arm and whispered gently,
we're really hurting for help, right? Ugh.
Barrett groaned. He turned to Tifa sharply, his gun arm shaking fiercely.
That money's for Marlene Scoulin.
He then turned and glared at Cloud.
2,000.
He snapped, before turning away and folding his arms stubbornly, refusing to discuss the matter any more than that. Tifa sighed with immense relief and smiled at Cloud gently.
Thanks, Cloud.
End of chapter.